There, it's going. Now,
Going?
yes. Maybe I didn't do it simultaneously. This is Kay Schultz talking with Jean Hayford on June 12, 1977. Jean, tell us something about when you first came to Captiva, what it was like then.
we first came to the island in February of 1938, staying at Twin Waters. We became much interested in shells and sea life. Alice Miner and ourselves had very dear mutual friends. In fact, we had been a frequent visitor at her home in Glencoe. Because Alice was interested in dredging and acquiring sea life, Max became her real helper. Our bathtub at Twin Waters was sometimes filled with all kinds of life. They were transferred to aquariums or were being mounted. 1939, the next year, we returned. By that time, Max was and Ding Darling became very close friends. Again, the next year, because we wanted to bring our children and maid, we rented the Pine Cottage at Mrs. Mitchell's. At that time, Grace did not exactly like having children around. We spent the month of March here. And at that time, I became part of island life, and they had a big Red Cross benefit up at Loomis. By that, Loomis House had just been built, and we were up there for the big benefit. Everybody brought pies and cakes and.
Now you're talking about the James Loomis Sr., which is now Woolahans.
Yes, that's right.
Oh.
Mrs. Judge Williams was the president of at that time of the Women's Association, and we auctioned everything off. I know a pie that I took was sold for $5, which was enormous, and we made about $1,400 in that sale.
Now, what were you raising the money for?
For the Red Cross.
Oh, for the Red Cross.
For the Red Cross.
Yes.
And every year after that, in March, they held a Red Cross exhibit. One time it was down at Mrs. Ewing's home, and again, everything was auctioned off, and they had several paintings that were being done by local artists, and they were auctioned off at very large prices in that day, and so we again made quite a bit of money. Well, finally, the Women's Association turned into what is now the Civic Association. We decided at that time, about that time, this was the last year, this was about in 1945, 46, I guess. Well, no, it was 44. Mrs. Carr decided that it would be nice if we would ask the men to come and join us. So we were meeting at that time. We began meeting at that time in the church. Before that, we'd always had little tea parties at ladies' homes. But we met in the evening at the church, and Mr. John Sims, a lawyer from Baltimore, was elected our first president, men president, that is. So we became the Civic Association at that time. And it was very interesting. We did a lot of little work. I know I was, one time had been in charge of the beautification committee.
How can you beautify Captiva?
Well, we were concerned about the pine trees, the roots uprooting the road out here. So I took a couple of little colored boys, and we chopped the roots going across the road.
Oh, for heaven's
And
sake.
then we also killed the...
This was before the roads were paved.
Oh yes, no, this was after the pavement. It was just after the pavement.
After the paving.
You see, the pavement was done in 1942 by the WPA.
Oh.
We were here at that time when it was being done.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a terrible. It rained all the time. Our road was completed, but Sanibel was just starting theirs, but because they had to dredge so much and there was so much rain, we had, 2 and 3 inches seemed to me every other day or two. The road became a mire, and they had to have a horse to haul people out, so they stopped. And so Sanibel did not get their road paved.
No, we came here the first time in 1948 when my folks had bought the house we're in now. And at that time, Sanibel was only paved to Periwinkle. you know, and then from Bailey's store on, you were on your own in terrible corduroy, sandy
That
roads.
was it. You see, at that time they were paving that section of the road, but because it was so muddy and so wet and everybody was getting stuck, they just had to discontinue. So that's why it was discontinued for, and the WPA went out of existence. They took the men over to Foreign Page Field.
Oh.
And so they never got back here on the island.
Oh.
But anyway, it was very, very primitive here on the island. There wasn't, and when we first started building this house, we were the only house between our place and Al O'Brien's.
Oh, yes.
There wasn't any.
Nothing in between.
Nothing between here and the bridge.
Now, how big a piece of property did you have? What?
Well, when we first started coming here, we bought 100 feet of Turner's subdivision down there at that time. We intended to build there when we first came, but then this property came up for sale. Or it was the Hall estate, and Jimmy Whiteman was the executor, and he was having a terrible time. He couldn't find anybody that wanted it, and he asked Max what was the trouble, and Max said, well, first place, I think you're asking too much. He said, you know, everybody just bought down at the Turner place, and you're asking about 3 times what that went for, and so that's all Max said. But pretty soon he came back and he said, the judge has given you the property. Max said, I wasn't buying it.
Oh.
But he went in and talked to Harry Fagan, who was quite a friend of ours. And
Was he the judge?
What's that?
Was he the judge or the
No,
administrator?
he was just a banker. Harry
I
Fagan was
see.
president of the bank, you know. And he just said, well, Max, I think you ought to buy it. It's a good piece of property. And so Max said, well, all right. So he came back and told me, and I said, well, I guess we will. So then we said, well, we like this piece of property. I think we'll build our house here. So we started building our house at that time. And way back in 38 or 39, Max was much interested in making concrete blocks. And at that time, we had a lot of Turners, and so we turned that into a little experiment.
Now, when you talk about Turners,
It's the Turner subdivision, you know, where our place was what is now, was the Hoffman place.
yes.
Well, we had all of our equipment there.
I mean, all along that so-called Gold Coast, that was called the Turner.
Walter Turner
subdivision.
owned it. At
I
one
see.
time, at Tweenwater for Sunday dinner, this was in 1938, Walter came for dinner, and he told Grace Price that he needed money very badly, and he'd like to sell his property now. So Kurt Dugdale bought 400 feet, and Elizabeth Fenton bought 2 different lots, 100 here and 100 on the other side of us, and can't say their name now. Betty Henderson's mother,
Eager.
Mrs.
Eager.
They bought 200 feet, and we were right, and then we were right in there too, and then Walter turned 100 feet over to Grace Price because she had been instrumental in getting all these people interested in it. So he gave her, which is now the Severing House place.
I see. But all his property went Gulf to Bay?
No, just Gulf to the road.
Gulf to the road.
But he gave us rights to have a dock of 60 feet, that is, docks along a 60-foot easement on the bay, but he never came through with that.
I see.
I tried to get him to, but he never did in his lifetime anyway. But then we decided we liked this place better because we did have from Gulf to Bay. And
Now, did you build that house of what was the Hoffmans?
yes,
Was it-
yes, I built it after Max's death
Oh, I see. But you had bought the property
in
when
38.
he was alive, but didn't do anything
Didn't
with it.
do anything with
All
it.
right, I see.
So we built here first, and then Mac conceived
This
down
particular house that you're in
this
now?
house here.
Yes.
This house here. We started in 45. It was completed in 46. We started in 44, actually.
How much of it did Max do?
Quite a bit. All of it.
He did. You had a contractor, and he just
No,
decided.
he did almost. He hired island labor, which was pretty scary.
Yes.
But Max had been was a graduate engineer from Northwestern, and he also had been associated with Welland Homes in Evanston, building houses for sale. So he knew something about building houses.
Yes, sure.
Of course, he didn't do the actual work there, but he oversaw it and drew plans and so forth.
Now, he was retired by this time.
No, he wasn't retired till we came in 44. The
I
doctor
see.
made him retire.
Mm-hmm.
And so we came down here, and he started then. When he was, one time when he was sick at Northwestern, in the hospital, he designed a steel frame for making concrete blocks, and he had the university build it for him. So we brought that down, and that's how all of these blocks were made. And you see they're much smaller size than the ordinary.
And did you make these cinder
We made 'em
blocks
right
right
here.
on the property?
We made them right out on the beach.
Well, what did you do for materials?
We used the sand beach, and we got cement in by truck, and we hired one of Grace Price's former men called T-Bone, and he actually did the work.
For heaven's
And then there
sakes.
was a man here from Ohio that was a bricklayer. He was down here for a year's vacation, so he became our bricklayer.
Oh.
So Max didn't really do so much of the work himself, but all the children had part in making some of the blocks. I know.
Well, I hadn't realized that you'd done that much manufacturing of it.
Yes, we did all the blocks, and we had our own brick machine, and we made our own bricks.
For the fireplace?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the original fireplace that you put in? Isn't that fun?
And this tile was part of Benjamin Marshall's tile that he brought to make his studio up there in Evanston, and he gave us this tile to bring down here for our fireplace.
It's lovely. It's very attractive. And you laid that and...
Well, we had a man
Sure.
with it, yes.
Oh, that's great. Lovely.
But, let's see now. Better turn it off now. Well, we built our own house, started in 44, and we actually moved in 45. In 46, it was completed. And then in 46, we built the house out in front for Carrie Hope, who was Phoebe Peabody's mother-in-law, actually. And it was designed for her and built for her. And
Now,
she
this
got
is the little house that Chet Loomis lives in now.
No, that's a house that Chet Loomis has. And she lived in it for many years. She was a widow. And then finally she did marry Jim, Wiley, I guess. Anyway, then one day when Max was working there, Mary Spalding came down and she said, "Oh, I'm much interested in this little house. Would you build us one?" And at that time she had, and the Barretts had built property further down the lane, and she wanted to build a house. And Max said, "Well, I will build it for you, but you'll have to get somebody to design it. I'm not a licensed architect, and I don't want to build for anybody else." Well, at that time they said, well, Max started building for the Barretts, what we called the Pink House at that time, which is now where the Smiths are living, and we built that house for
This is the Wilson Smiths.
Wilson Smith.
Yes.
We built that house for William Felton Barrett, and they were going to share it at first with the Spalding until they could get their properties built, which they did for a number of years. The Spaldings came for a part of the time, and the Barretts came in for the rest of the time.
Now, when you say Mary Spalding, she is
Albert
the
Spalding.
wife of Albert Spalding, the concert violinist.
That's right.
All right.
And
Had they been coming for quite a while before
no,
that?
Marjorie Barrett came over one day just on the spur of the moment, and she saw the island and fell in love with it. And she went back and told the Bixbys and the Spaldings and all that she found her dream place. And so she just couldn't wait to get them all down here. So the Bixbys bought their part, and the Spaldings bought their section, 300. They had 300 feet. Marjorie Barrett had 400 feet, I believe. And the Bixbys, I believe, 200 feet. And so the Bixbys built their house first. Johnny Wakefield built their house for them. And that time, Max wasn't interested in building for anybody else, particularly but himself. And Mary Spalding came down and said, "Well, we want you to build a house." So he said, "All right, you get an architect to design it." So they did. And they brought it down, and Max looked at it and he said, "Oh, Mary, do you know how complicated this house is and how much it's going to cost you?" "Oh," she said, "I don't want it to cost anything." He said, "Well, if you look at this plan, it was very, very complicated, very fancy." And so she just took it like this and tore it up.
Oh.
And she said, "You're going to design our house, and you're going to make it just like the Pink House up here, only a little larger." So he said, all right, he would do it. And so he did. He built their house for them. it didn't have an open porch. It would be where she called her playroom. It was enclosed instead of open, but it had the two wings on the sides and everything like that. So she was delighted. And then finally, William Felton Barrett didn't want to have a house, but finally Marjorie persuaded Max to build her a house. And they made the bricks with our brick machine, not concrete blocks, and the house was made of solid brick. Just before that, he had built a house out of solid brick for Mac Mackenzie down here.
Yes.
And so she had seen that and said, that's just what we want too. So that he finally had built all those places there.
And now that Mackenzie place is still there.
Still there.
Yes.
Still there, and the children love it.
Yes.
It's solid brick.
My goodness, you don't get many of those, do you?
No, you don't. You don't. It's a beautiful house. That's one of the lovely houses, actually.
Now that takes care of your house here, the one that the Wilson Smiths are in, and the one the Chet Loomises are in,
That's
that
right.
are all on your
It was
property.
all our properties.
All your
Not
property.
until the Loomises bought their little piece. Then the Smiths got interested, and so I sold to them. And then I said I didn't want to sell anything more.
Yes. Yes.
But finally the Smiths had bought all the way. It's just 75 feet wide. That's all they had, was 75 feet wide.
Your original property was 150
50
wide by 1,100
deep.
Yes.
And at least that's what the abstract says. I don't think
Yes.
it's quite 1,100 feet, but it's roaded away, both front and back.
Yes.
But anyway, then the Smiths went from about 60 feet in front of their house, clear through. And then they turned around and sold 75 feet to Codman Hisler.
Yes.
So he put his house on that.
I see.
And he wanted to buy the Robin's Nest. And that's a funny little house that just kind of like topsy-grew. When Dolly Malone was building the Pearsall house and the Ross house and the Gray house, he had to have some place to live. And he came to us and said, can I build a little place on your property? And Max said, well, yes, if I can design it and you build it. And because we're going away, at that time we always went back to Evanston in the summertime. And he said, we're gone all summer, but you can live in it. And he specified what it should be, but when we came back, that wasn't what he had built. He had just put the concrete slab in, but no running water or anything, though we had told him he could, and that take off our well. We had a well by that time, a deep well that Betty Gray and the Rosses and ourselves and even Millie Perry were in on.
I see.
And it was a perfectly horrid roof. It was a kind of a halfway flat roof that looked terrible, and we didn't like it a bit. But anyway, he was gone, so we took and doubled it in size and put in a bathroom and put in a kitchen sink and remodeled it.
Mm-hmm.
And then later I decided I wanted it even bigger, so I added on the little kind of closed in the porch and made it bigger and made a room out of that.
So you've always sort of rented it as a little guest house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At first we built it we wanted it for our children,
Yes.
my son who was in college and my future son-in-law coming down together, and they would live in the house. And so whoever rented had to be out of it at Christmas time and out of it Easter vacation,
Yeah.
but they could have it in between.
Yeah, that was a good arrangement.
Well, it was. We had several people, but that's the way they rented to. The Reams liked it that way, and then we had another old gentleman that took for a while, and he'd always go away for Christmas vacation and come back, and so it worked out very nicely.
Oh, that was great. Yeah.
But then we rented, after the children were married, we rented to well, the Reams rented for a while, and then Elizabeth Bennett came in and took it for a long time, and then Connie Hisler.
Mm-hmm. I remember Elizabeth Bennett.
Well, she was in it for about 5 years.
Yes. And then Cotty lived in it for quite
Yes,
a while.
Cotty, and he wanted me to sell it to him, but I refused to do it.
Yes.
I
So
said,
then he bought the back end of the Wilson
back in,
Smiths.
and they had a very happy situation.
Yeah. Now I heard you mention something about Perry, and I remember my mother saying something about the Lockwood Perrys.
Yes,
Now,
the Lockwood-
whose property was the Lockwood
The
Perrys?
one next to me, which is now the Croft.
Oh, yes.
And the Lockwood Perrys had been coming up to old Captiva Lodge.
Yes, that's right next door to our house.
Yes.
Yes.
And were you here when that burned?
Yeah, well, we came the day after it burned.
The day after.
Our daughter was
Oh, we were
down
here.
here. Our daughter was down here staying with Mother and Father. Had been down for a couple of months. They were staying at the lodge when this Ellis house next door came on the market.
Yes.
And so Dad bought it.
I remember where it came on
And
the
they
market.
moved into it. And 1 week after they moved in, the lodge burned to the ground.
That's right. And it burned within 15 minutes. It was down to the ground.
Gone. And we were on our way down here, and Mother had given us directions, follow the signs that say Captiva Lodge. So when we got to the island store, we couldn't see anything more just there, so I went in and said, where is Captiva Lodge? And they said, why are you guests there? It burned last night. And I said, she said, everybody's gone back to Fort Myers. And I said, no, we weren't guests. We really were looking for the Alt's house next door. And whoever this was in the store turned to her husband and said, did they ever save that other little house? And I had visions of our having driven down 1,500 miles to get our daughter, and where is she? You know, gone over to Fort Myers, where? But fortunately, they were still there, but my dad got badly burned in trying to save his house, which he'd only been in 1 week from burning. And in fact, the glass cracked, and a lot of the paint on the windowsills is still very bumpy from where the paint all blistered and bubbled on it. And there was no fire control at all then. They had a bucket brigade.
In fact, in those early days, I think I was the first fire truck that we had. At that time, we had a Jeep. And they did have a big water container, and they'd put it on the Jeep, and then I'd drive it around, because Max, he had a bad heart, and I didn't want him driving around, so many a fire on Sanibel, I was the driver for that truck all over the sawgrass and everything else.
Well, Dad said that they literally had a bucket brigade.
Yes, we did. When the Sims place, which is now John, next to the Eager property, that burned because during the war years they used to shoot bullets into the land here. They weren't supposed to, but they did. And many of them were incendiary bullets, and it started fires there. Then we had another fire that we had some soldiers stationed up in Tony's, I think it was Tony's house, or along there. John Wakefield was in charge of them, and they threw out cigarettes on the road and started several fires, and we had to fight those. But the Sims
These were soldiers who were stationed here?
They were in charge of the Bowman Beach bombing range.
Oh. Bowman's Beach was a bombing range.
Bowman Beach was a bombing range. They would drop down bags of flour.
Oh, for heaven's sake. And these people lived in the...
One of Captain Smith's cottages then.
Yes. The one that Francis Anderson always calls the Tony house.
I believe that was the house.
It was
either there or the twins. What was the twins?
The twins, yes.
It was one of those houses. I don't remember which
Who
one.
were the twins now?
Well, the twins were Althea and well, Althea was one of them. I can't think. Oh, it was terrible. I want to say a name, and I can't think of it. But they had been down at Marco Island at a hotel down there for many years. Not Marco, I mean it was Naples, off of Naples. And they came up here one day and found Twin Waters and decided they liked it, so they came to Twin Waters first and stayed. But they were ardent fishermen.
I can remember seeing these two old ladies sitting on the dock in the evening fishing, and we would go by in my father's boat, and he said, those two old ladies catch more fish than anybody on the island.
They were the best. They even went down to Marco every spring when the snook were running, and had a favorite guide down there, and they stayed at the old Marco Inn, and that was the days before Marco was the island it is now, and had tremendous stories of fishing,
And they lived in the little house that is...
it's now the Smith cottage.
Bill and Barbara.
Bill and Barbara Smith.
You mean White?
White, I mean.
Bill and Barbara White.
Bill and
Yes.
Barbara White.
Well,
Bill
they
and
tore
Barbara
down that
White.
original
Oh,
house.
yes, they tore it down.
And built the one they're
And-
in now.
And built the one we're in now.
That's the house that belonged to the twins.
That
That
belong-
isn't Phoebe.
You see, no, Phoebe's was torn down too.
Yes.
And that's where.
Francis Anderson built her
No.
house.
All of those were Captain Smith's cottages.
I
He
see.
built them all.
And
along
who
there.
was Captain Smith?
Captain Smith is the one that died during the 44 hurricane, you know, Max Berry, that I'll tell you about later.
Okay, that's what we're going to hear about. All right. So then to go back, the next door to you was the Lockwood Perrys.
Lockwood Perry.
And that
But
is the
then
house that is now the Croft place.
And that is now the house. I'm sorry, I have a hard time with my throat.
Okay.
Maybe I won't be able to talk about it. But yes, Lockwood Perry, well, at that time, Mrs. Strand lived on it.
Yes.
There was an old house that Mrs. Strand lived in.
Down on the bay.
Well, it was halfway, it was about where their house is standing now.
Oh,
It was about where their house is standing now. It wasn't on the bay.
I see.
But,
And Clara Strand lived in there.
Clara Strand lived in there. And her former husband was Captain Strand, who was a great fishing guide and took everybody fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an interesting old character. He was an old rum runner.
Oh, a rum runner.
Yes, running. And the old days when during the whiskey.
Oh, that's funny.
He had many fascinating stories to tell of those days.
I would love to hear some of those stories about
Well,
it too.
I'm afraid that most of them are gone.
But I do remember then too that when they tore down that little house that Clara Strand lived in to build their house, isn't that when, I think Mother said, some of the men in the community felt it was too bad that a character as colorful and as long time on the island as Clara Strand was being booted out to build a nice house for somebody. And so some of the men built her that little house there
Well,
on the main,
actually,
on Munson Street.
No, actually, this old Charlie Jennings that lived on the back of our property, but he came here in the 44 hurricane, and when we bought the place, he said, I suppose I have to move. And Max said, well, no, as long as you watch after our boat, why, you can stay for a while. But
He was
said,
sort of a squatter.
He was a squatter,
Yes.
although he did finally pay $6 a month rent.
Oh.
But he acted as our caretaker.
Yes.
And, but at that time, you know, it was after the war, and these Quonset huts were being sold by the government.
Mhm.
So Clara Strand bought 2 of them, and old man Jennings put them together. But old Mrs. Grumman was very much provoked to think that Mrs. Strand had got that property right in back of her, because she had been using it as a garbage dump.
Oh.
So they had to get rid of piles and piles of junk that were on that place.
Oh my.
I can tell this story now because they're all gone.
They're all gone. Yes.
But
Oh, I think that's very funny.
yeah, it was. Oh, Miss Strand just. Oh, she just about had a fit. And Miss Ruman didn't like Miss Strand being there at all.
I'll bet not. Mrs. Strand was quite a character,
Yeah, she was
and
really, she people made fun of her and
she was
talked about her.
good-hearted.
Oh, she was the kindest and sweetest soul that ever was. When Mr. Jennings was so sick, she took care of him, and she came down from her house up there every morning at 7 o'clock to take care of him. And that's another funny story. I just realized he couldn't stay at my place anymore. And so I went in to Snag Thompson, the sheriff at that time, and said, how can I get rid of him? And he said, well, I know where his daughter lives. And I said, oh, you do? And he said, yes, I'll. And so he called her. She lived in Texas. He called her up by telephone, no expense to me, and got the daughter here within 3 days, and got her father out of there and up to her sister's house that lived in Punta Gorda, and took care of him. Oh,
That's
he was
interesting.
cross about that. He didn't want to. He tried to come back again on the mailboat that time, and the mailboat captain wouldn't let him board the boat. He said, you don't have any place to live over there. You can't go. He knew the story, too.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
So and then we took the house and tore it down and moved the foundation over and built our boathouse on it.
Mhm. Well, when we would come down here to visit Mother and our children were little, one of the first things Mother always did was walk them over to Mrs. Strand's shell shop.
Mhm.
And she'd buy them old little dolls made out of cockle shells
Oh,
and
yes.
whistles and mice and so on. And they loved it. Well, interestingly enough, the first time my daughter came down here with her child, she said, Mom, the first thing we got to do is take them over to Mrs. Strand's and buy something for them. This is just part of my childhood, and I want my children to go over there. Well, Mrs. Strand wouldn't let you buy anything.
No,
But
she'd give it to you.
Give it to you, yes. You know, you'd buy one thing, and she'd turn around and give you 2 more because
That's
she
right.
felt so bad at taking your
That's
money.
right, because I had trouble taking my children up there because every time she did it, she'd say, well, Miss Hayford, you've done so much for me, I wouldn't take a penny from you.
Right.
And I said, oh, but Mrs. Strand, I want to. And so I had to just send somebody up there to buy for me without her knowing it, or else she would just
Right.
give the children away.
She obviously didn't need a lot to live on, and she was perfectly content with what she
money
had.
somewhere.
She had some money somewhere.
Somewhere. She was actually a gypsy queen from Hungary, I think.
She looked like it.
Yeah, she was.
My children thought she rather looked like a witch.
Yes,
She
I
was
know.
little and
But you know,
stooped
she
and long
washed
black
her-
hair.
She washed her hair every week. I used to see her out here and drying it in the sun. And then she'd take an old iron and frizz it up. I said one day, I said, Miss Strand, you have such pretty hair. Why do you do? Oh, I have to do that, she said.
Oh, she was a gypsy queen.
Yes, she was.
Oh,
Or that is, she came from a gypsy tribe over in Hungary, and she wrote to her people over there all the time.
Well, I had never heard that. That's very interesting.
Yes, she was a gypsy.
Yes. Now, I think right now Bob Rauschenberg, the artist, owns that piece of property, that little house
Yes, she
where she
willed
had her
it.
shop.
She willed it to a police family, a policeman's mother, who had taken care of her when she became sick here and had to live in town. And they had taken care of her, so she willed that property to them. And then I think he sold it to Rauschenberg.
I see.
I don't know who lives in it now. Do you know?
I think he rents it, and I think maybe just to people who work on the island. But he has a lot of people who come down to study with him and work with him, and maybe they live there. I don't know just who
It's
lives
not a
there
bad
now.
little house.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't.
Well,
On with the show here.
all right. Listen, I can get this on.
Jean, tell us about the hurricane of '44. I understand your house has always been used during hurricanes for
That's
everybody
right.
to stay here because it was so safe. And you must have some good stories to tell about that.
Well, we were living in Al O'Brien's captain's cottage, which at that time was situated in front of her house. We had had radio information that the center of the hurricane would hit here just after midnight. It was located about 5 miles offshore. At about 2 p.m., we were sitting on the front porch playing gin actually, and Ding had told us we must get our things up 2 feet above the ground that were stored in his studio. All of our furniture had come down, and until our house was built, we had stored some in this. That time the island store was vacant, and that was filled with our furniture, and the rest of it was up at Jake Darling's. So all of a sudden the wind began to blow very hard, and it turned very black. We dashed the car and drove up the road to get up to Ding's. As we approached the Loomis house, we saw 2 big pine trees across the road. There were lots of debris around, and then there was no sign of Belton's house. Belton's house at that time, that he lived in at that time, was built up on concrete piles, and the house was on the 2nd floor, and he stored his boat or his chars and so forth, had a shop underneath. But there was nothing left of the house at all. The roof was gone, every bit of the house was gone, and the only thing that was left were the concrete pilings that were just twisted. You could see the concrete bars, the steel bars, and just twisted like a corkscrew.
For heaven's sakes. Now, this was before the hurricane actually struck?
It came across Buck Key. For years you could see that hole through Buck Key, and came across and hit Belton's house completely and went on out into the Gulf. And so his house is out in the Gulf someplace.
It just took his house right out into
Just took it right up. And Max looked over, and Belton was just picking himself off the ground. And
Was he in it at the time?
all of them were in it.
Oh.
Belton, his wife Miriam, and their daughter Jeanette, and grandmother Gore was there because the hurricane was coming, and Beulah didn't want her to stay in the house down there, and so Beulah and TM went up to the house on Palm Avenue, anyway. And Belton was just picking himself up, so Max ran over to help him, and Belton said, well, Mrs. Gore is hurt very badly, and would Jean take her back to the cottage? And I said, well, of course I would. And so I took her back to the cottage.
That you were living in?
That we were living in. And
which was on Alice O'Brien's?
It was at Alice O'Brien's Captain's cottage. It was situated in front of their house, you see. And Alice had told us if there was a hurricane, we must move into her house.
Yes.
I didn't want to, but we did. And then, well, never mind. I can do it without. And so I took her back to the house, and her eye was cut very badly. The milk bottle had fallen out of the icebox and hit her in the face and cut a bad gash right over her eye, just right here. And then her arm was broken at about just below the shoulder. So I bandaged her arm tight to her body, and then cleaned the eye gash and pulled it together with a butterfly bandage, and then I asked her if she had any heart trouble, and she said, oh no, I'm strong as an ox. And I said, well, fine. And so I gave her a couple aspirins and then some Seconal capsules of Max's to kind of, I knew she was going into shock soon, and I wanted to quiet her down and maybe put her to sleep for a while. So I did, and she did. She slept for a little while, and then Max came back to the house and said, we've got to move back over to Al O'Brien's, and Belton and his wife and Miriam and the Malones are coming down to stay with us. So we moved back there, but Al's house was very inconvenient to be in a hurricane, because in order to get to the bedrooms and the bathroom, you had to go out through the back screen porch and across the screen porch to get into the bedroom, a long ways from the living room. So it was rather inconvenient during the storm, but anyway, we stayed, and dear Mother Gore would wake up once in a while and she'd say, you suppose I could have a hot toddy? And never cried, never fussed about the pain or anything. She was just a perfect darling. And we'd say, oh, of course, and so we'd get her a nice hot toddy. And Miriam kind of complained. She had a couple of broken ribs, and Jeanette had some scratches, and she kind of whimpered. She was a young 10 or 12-year-old kid at that time. And Belton, we discovered, had a spike in his side. A great big nail had been driven in his side. So Max got that out and cleaned that wound and dressed it. And then he was all right. Didn't seem to bother him anymore.
What time of year was this hurricane?
October. About the 18th, I believe, of October.
As late as that?
Yes. We always had them in the full moon of October at that time. Both the next that storm and the next storm, and that was a dry hurricane. Yeah, so that everything on the island, Alice O'Brien's main house had just been painted, and it was a color of brown the next morning. It was just burned to all the sides. The paint had just been literally blown off of it.
Oh.
It looked terrible. It was just dirty looking, and it was awful. And all the shrubbery and everything was just brown, as if they'd been burned. And not until the next day did it start to rain. But the next morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, we wanted to look at our house out in front. And so Max and I went out to see if it was all right. And it was just as tight as a drum, and we'd stayed there. And then he and Dolly Malone started walking up the beach. I don't think that'll help. Leftover tea. Dolly Malone started walking up the beach to see how Mrs. Fayram had. We tried to get her to come with us, but she said no, she was going to stay in her house. And dear Miss Kay, do you remember her?
Now, Miss Fayram is the one that was Sarah Dennis's
yes,
benefactor,
that's right,
and who left her house to Sarah Dennis.
Yeah.
Which is the one that now she sold to
the Stegmans.
Stegmans,
yeah.
Yes.
And Miss Kay was Miss Trula Rowe's very dear friend, and they lived together for many, many years until Miss Kay died, and then Miss Rowe moved out to California, I believe, with her daughter or something.
Yes.
Anyway, Max felt very concerned about them, but they'd gone to bed with a bottle of sherry wine. Didn't even know when the hurricane hit.
For heaven's sake.
They were perfectly fine. Well, in the meantime, I went back to the house, and of all things, Mrs. Malone thought that when anybody was sick, they should have a cathartic, and she'd given Miss Grandmother Gore a big dose of Epsom salts. They're out, and then she left.
Oh dear.
So I was the only one left to take care of Mother Gore.
This is the famous Hattie Gore.
Yes,
Yes.
it is.
All right.
That is, we lived
Yes.
on Buckhead.
Yes.
Oh, she was a dear. See, she was really our first postmistress.
Yes. Well, in almost all of the books that have been written about the island, Hattie Gore is revered. You know, as practically
she
the
was absolutely
first lady of the island.
She was the first, dearest lady that ever was.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you about this when you shut off. Anyway.
Okay. Would you like
what?
it off and
Just
wait a minute?
Just a minute.
All right.
I hope everything's all right.
It's going fine. Yes.
So anyway, then I had Mother Gore to take care of, and I couldn't carry her to the bathroom, clear across the porch and into the long, big bedroom, then into a dressing room, and then into the bathroom. So I just got a pail.
I would think a hurricane was enough trouble without an old lady who had Epsom salts.
Well, the only bed they had was a big davenport in the living room, and that was the only bed for her. The rest of us had just sit in chairs all night, you know. We didn't. That's all we could do. But anyway, I took care of her, and pretty soon Dalton and Maxon came back, and they said, well, Jean, you had quite a time. So I got the supper for us all, and nobody else came. Miriam was gone with her mother. They were staying someplace, I don't know where. Miriam and Jeanette were gone, and so it was just Dalton and Maxon and I. So they said, well, they would carry Mrs. Gore into the bathroom at each time, and you go to bed. So I lived down on Brian's bed, and they would carry her back and forth to the bathroom. And one time they got her there, and of course they had to lift her dress and help her. And one time they left her with a roll of toilet paper, and she dropped it and rolled all the way across. So I then and got that. But anyway, the next day she was better. And Andy came down.
Andy Rossi?
Andy Rossi came down, and he said, well, Belton, you and I could rig up a chair and tie Mrs. Gore in it, and I think we could get her to town. So they did. Not that day, but the third day afterwards, they rigged up this chair, just these reed chairs, you know.
Mm-hmm.
They tied her in it, and they got Belton's boat going. And so they carried the chair, and carried her in it, and carried the chair down.
Now, by this time, the hurricane had blown itself out.
But you know, Tiem came down, but I never saw Bill. Tiem came down to see how we were, and I said, well, we're getting along all right. And so they carried her to town, and the doctor said I'd done just the right thing to tie her arm up so it couldn't be moved. Mm-hmm. And he never did a thing to the eye, and it never even made a scar. He said it was bandaged just correctly.
Good for
you. Dr.
you.
Bosselman, he said, who did this? And they said, well, it was Jean Hayford.
Oh.
And so he said, well, she did a fine job.
Good.
So
That's good.
I became the help then after that. Anytime anybody was injured, they came to me. Oh, I know one time when Mary Spaulding's house was entered, they were looking for the culprit, and this old fisherman, Rossi or something, what was his name? He ran some cactus spurs in his foot, and I wish you'd seen his foot. I had to pull them all out and soak and dress it. And then a little child fell into a bonfire. At that time, John Henderson was here helping me, and he showed me how to dress a fire wound.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got that, and then the next winter, a car drove down here full speed. They'd been up at Andy's and gotten very drunk, and they drove right into that pine tree there, and she went through the windshield, and she cut her face clear across here. Just millions of little pieces of glass. Well, Jane, my daughter-in-law, was with me, and she ran down. The only telephone we had at that time on the island was down at the ferry boat.
Mm-hmm.
She ran down, and she got Buddy Boat to fly over and landed on the dock, and we carried her to the dock and took her in, but they said again, who did the first aid?
Oh, good for you.
And then another time I had Mrs. Barrett had a housekeeper maid, very elderly, had pure white skin and white hair, and she started to light the gas oven, and her match went out, and instead of closing the gas off, she reached for another match, and by the time she opened the oven door, it blew right in her face, and her whole face was burned all the way down here.
Oh, dear.
Well, they were Christian Scientists, and they didn't want to take her to hospital, and I said, you have to take this woman to hospital. You cannot leave her here on this place. She's got to have her burns checked, she'll go into shop, and she's an elderly lady, and I won't be responsible for her to be left here in this condition. So they did take her in, and again, John Henderson had given me all the first aid equipment for burns, and I had picked off all the dead flesh and covered her whole face and everything with this solution stuff that he'd given me. And they took her in, and they said, "Who did the first aid?" And again, I was complimented by Dr. Bosman and said, "Well, that was perfect."
Isn't that great?
So, and she didn't have any scars or anything either.
Hmm.
But now I don't have to do anything like that.
Well, I hope you don't ever get called out for doing anything like that.
I don't mind it.
No.
Max once, he did something to his thumb and had to have some stitches in it. And the doctor said, "Hold it up," and I held his arm. So the doctor from Twin Waters took care of it.
You never learned to put in stitches, huh?
Well, I wouldn't want to.
No, but I bet you could if you had to.
Maybe. Anyway, it was fun in those days. You know, we were very primitive. There wasn't anything here, and people just had to do it for themselves.
That's right, and you had to help each other out, too.
Mm-hmm. We did. We helped each other out, and everybody. Oh, we must. Sunday night was Twin Waters was the gayest time. We had song fest at Sunday night at Twin Waters. Max and I would go after Sunday night, and we'd sing, and then sometimes Sandy Coleman and Al always came over, and there weren't many people here, and we just made a little company of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And one night Sanders said, "Let's have a masquerade party, and we'll call it a music festival, and each one of you have to get dressed up." I don't think I can tell you.
Oh, come on, tell it. I'm all interested, all ears.
No, better turn that off. Now that more of the every Sunday night after dinner.
Now, Grace Price, who owned Tween Waters, was Dottie Wakefield's mother, right?
And she was the greatest lady. She could mimic anybody, and had a great sense of humor, and she just was wonderful. And of course, Matt sang. He could sing and sing and sing, and he knew songs.
And he played the guitar.
He played the guitar. And Mary Bailey would play the piano. Mary was always here.
Yes.
And so we really had wonderful times.
And you'd go back to Sandra Coleman's house.
Then several times Sandra wanted one time to have a masquerade party. So she said, "Everybody go home and get dressed up and come back to my house, and we'll have a musical at my house." So we did, and we all got up in fancy costumes and mimicked some of the people and go back to her house and had more fun.
Yeah, well, that sounds great.
Oh, and I've got pictures of one. Then finally, Sandra decided one Sunday that she'd have a luncheon in her patio out in back, and we would all come dressed up if we wanted to, or as natural. But she and Al O'Brien got dressed up as French waiters.
Not quite coordinated.
You were pushing
one and then the other, right?
Well, anyway, so we had quite. Oh, I've got pictures of that party. It was just a fun party. Max and I had come up. That was one year that we were down at Miss Mitchell's coconut cottage, and we'd come up in a boat. And so we had a great time. Everybody was. And another party that.
Did you mostly come back and forth from town by boat, or would you take your car in the ferry boat?
Well, your gas. No, we went in our car, but gas was rationed to that. You could get plenty of gas for your boat, but your car was rationed, so we didn't use our car except to go back and forth to town, and we went on the ferry boat.
Yeah, right.
But we could get all the gas we wanted to if we used the boat. Mm-hmm. So lots of times we'd come up in the dark of the night to Tween Waters for dinner, and then go back, and they'd say, "How do you know how to get that?" And I says, "I know the direction by the trees how to go."
Oh.
Belton had taught him.
Yes. Was Belton in those days a fishing guide too?
He was a fishing guide, yes.
Yes.
Andy Rossi was a fishing guide in the first days at Tween Waters.
Yes.
And he was a great fishing guide. We had lots of fun with Andy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and the fish we'd catch were just tremendous. Groupers, great big ones, and so forth. We just caught more fish in those days than we would.
Were there enough people down here to keep these two men guides busy and make a living at it?
Belton was mainly Al O'Brien's captain that time.
Of her yacht. I
Her
remember
yacht.
she had a great big boat.
Oh, yeah, she had several of them. She had
Yes.
2 or 3 different Wanigans. Wanigan 1, 2, and 3.
Yes.
And, oh, it was Julie was the name of the other twin, Julie and Althea.
I see, yes.
And one time when the Wanigan was coming in, we all picked up a lot of hibiscus and threw them in the water as the boat was coming in. We got pictures of that too. We had a great time
Wasn't that fun?
ushering Al back.
Yes, Miss O'Brien was quite a well-known businesswoman, wasn't
my,
she,
yes.
up in,
Oh,
was
my.
it Minneapolis?
Well, yes, in Minneapolis, but also in North Florida. She had large lumber holdings in North Florida. In fact, our family, Al O'Brien, got at her mill up in North Florida
I see.
for our house and for the Betty. Now she's Mrs. Jim Gray. That time she
Oh.
she was the widow of another, and for Betty's house and for the Ross house and for the Thompson house. That was Dottie Thompson's house before the Pearsall bought it.
I see.
And the lumber for all these houses, even for Al's own house, came from her mills up in
Northern Florida.
across city, Chiefland, up in that area.
Mhm. And this is how, I guess she was a good friend of the Commons.
Oh yes, up
Minneapolis.
in St. Paul.
St. Paul. Now, did C.O. Common come down much, or was it mostly
yes. In the early
Sandra?
days, no, he came down regularly. He didn't stay as long as Sandra did. Sandra was here for 6 months, and he would only come after Christmas, maybe for 2 months or so.
Mhm.
And they had a big boat too
Mhm.
in those days.
Mhm.
And Jeremiah was his last boat captain. He had another captain before that, whose son married Jake Stokes' daughter.
Oh,
Again, I can't remember his name, but he was a great boat captain.
and Jeremiah lived in that little house where now Alice and
Right.
Rice
Right.
live up there.
Mhm. Jeremiah passed away about
Yes.
2 weeks ago.
Yes, I remember that. And then long after there was no boat there for him to run, didn't he just keep living there and
He did at first.
did a little painting? It seemed to me
Yeah.
he painted our house one time.
Yes, but then he built the Captiva Beach Apartments,
Oh.
and he
Oh.
also built the Pascal House.
Oh, Captain Jeremiah did that.
Mhm.
Did he build it for the Pascals, or did someone
No, he
else
built
own
for
it?
No, he built it for the Pascals.
I
The
see.
Pascals had stayed at his place the year before,
Mhm.
and they talked to him into building their house.
Mhm, mhm. And the one, and Quinn Ellis's house was the Dugdales, right?
Well, before that, it was the Joe Barker's house. They built it.
Oh,
Johnny Wakefield built it.
I see. That wasn't one of Max's.
No, Max passed away about that.
Mhm. When did Max die?
53.
And when did you begin staying down here all of the time?
Oh, about the last 3 years of his life, I think it was, maybe 4. We found that we liked it here so much in the summertime, and it was so hot sometimes in Evanston that we decided we liked it down here better. So but
Wasn't
we were-
any hotter here than in Evanston?
Oh, it was much nicer here actually,
Oh,
because your nights were cool, and you could go out on the beach, or you could go out in our boat in the water and be perfectly cool. In fact, cold.
yes.
So that we thoroughly. In fact, we didn't have air conditioning then. We had a lot of fans, but it was quite cool.
Were mosquitoes a problem then?
Yes. After the '44 hurricane, they were terrible. You couldn't outdoors and open your mouth; they'd fly right in.
Oh my.
They were just black swarms.
Mm.
My son arrived after the '44 hurricane. We were sitting at Twin Waters. At that time, we'd been staying at Mitchell's, and we went up Twin Waters for Sunday dinner. And after the '44 hurricane. No, we were here in this house. What's the matter? We were here, but then we went up to dinner for the. But for some reason or other, we had seen Mrs. Mitchell, and Denny arrived, not knowing from California. He was out of St. Mary, not knowing that he was in Air Force at that time, Navy Air Force, and he he arrived on Sanibel, the morning after the hurricane. And he got a taxi driving down to the ferry boat landing, but no ferry. Well, he talked a fisherman in to bring him over the island. He walked with his white uniform up to his knees in water from the ferry boat landing up to trade winds.
Oh,
Now,
my.
there was that much water.
Oh.
And he came to then he stopped at Miss Mitchell. She said, "Jenny, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I came to see Mother. Didn't know there was a hurricane." And so she said, "Well, she's up at Cleanwater for dinner, I know, so you go on up, I'll take you up there." So she took him up there. And this was 2 days after the hurricane, actually. And so she took him up there, and then we got in our car and were able to go down and see what had happened to Cassaville. Because Cassaville, all the houses were off. They'd just been blown to pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So that we all went down there.
Well, Cassaville's starting a new chapter. According to the paper now, Mariner has bought it. And well, this is going to be a company town before
It's going
Mariner is through. Mm-hmm.
So it's up at Captiva.
Yes, sure is.
I don't like it.
Tell me now about this person who died during the hurricane.
Well, that's
No, you
what I
didn't
thought
quite
I'd
get
done.
to that. No, you didn't.
We didn't quite finish it.
No, we didn't finish, so.
We didn't finish that part.
No.
Well, Max, have you got that on?
Yes, it's on.
Max came back. We hadn't quite finished that. Max came out on the beach, and he and Dolly Malone walked up the beach. Here was Mr. Carr waving his arms, and he said, "You know, the old captain died last night. He would do that."
What captain?
Captain Smith.
Smith, who owned the two little houses.
Well, there were 4 of them.
Oh, all right.
And about 3 or 4 days beforehand, we had taken Mr. Carr in town. He'd like to go to town and get some beer because Delphine wouldn't let him have any up here. And so we went to town. He said, "On the way back, can you stop at Bailey's store?" That was the old Bailey's store. And Jim Bailey was there. And he said, "Are you still the coroner?" And he said, "Yes, I am. I think," he said, "you know, I was elected 4 or 5 years ago, but I haven't heard of anybody else taking my place, so I guess I'm the coroner." He said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you know, the old captain's been in a coma for several days, and he's about to die any day now, and I want to know who's going to sign the death certificate." He said, "Well, you just come get me, and I guess I can." So when Colonel Carr said, "You know, he would die last night," and so...
Well, this was Colonel Carr, Susan's husband.
Not Colonel. This was Mr. Carr. I shouldn't say Colonel.
Okay.
Mr. Carr, an entirely different individual.
I thought
no
you were
relation.
talking about someone else.
No relation. He was a little man, not much bigger than I am. And so Max went in, and Delphine, his wife, was there, the Captain Smith's daughter. And she said, "Well, we'll have to bury him, you know, Florida law, when you can't have a person cremated, they have to, embalmed, they have to be buried within so many hours." So Diana, she said, "I think you'll find some cypress-like lumber down in the old boathouse." She said, "It's a wreck now, but maybe you can fish it out." So Dolly went down, and he found enough cypress boards to make a coffin. Very, very small, but very shallow. And Max said, "You know, you
Had
can't..."
he died yet?
Oh, yes, he
was dead, yes. All right.
So Max told her, he said, "You know, Delphine, you can't put any padding in this coffin. It's not big enough. It's only 9 inches high." And the captain was a big man. He had quite a prominent nose. So Max came home to see me then, and then went back again. And here the captain was laid out in the coffin, but his nose stuck up about 2 inches above the coffin.
Oh.
Max didn't know what he was going to do, whether he was going to
Why did they
hammer
make the coffin so shallow?
That was the only lumber they had.
Oh.
There were 10-inch boards which dressed down to 9, so many inches.
Yes.
4
And a storm was going on, so you couldn't go anywhere else?
Yeah, we couldn't get any other lumber. It was only lumber on the place.
Oh.
So that they only had, I think, 4 boards or something, 5 boards, something like that. That's all they had.
Mm-hmm.
And just enough to make 2 sides, a bottom and a top.
And a top.
And it was only just so wide.
Good thing he was a little man.
He wasn't a little man. He was great big.
Oh.
He was a great big man. He was 6 feet.
Oh.
And the lumber was just that, and that's
Just
it.
that.
Oh. And so Max didn't know what he'd do, and then all of a sudden he saw there was padding in it. So he scooped him out and put him on the bed and rolled up the stuff. And fortunately there was an outside door, so he went down to the dock and threw the wadding overboard, and knew Delphine wouldn't go down there because he had a hard time getting out on the dock because it was ruined. it was completely ruined. And so then he went back and put him back in and nailed it up tight. And so then she said, you know, we've moved up the funeral. We were going to have it at 3 o'clock, but we're going to have it at 2 o'clock. Well, it was 2 o'clock then, and I said, well, we'll have to hurry. We had the only car available, and we had a 2-wheel trailer that was in Al Miner's garage. But across the island were these windrows, which were about 2 or 3 feet high, of just sand and pine boughs and limbs and so forth. About every 4 or 5 feet was one of these windrows across the island. I used to have a picture, but somebody swiped it.
So you could hardly drive.
I think my daughter
Oh.
swiped it. But anyway, Max had a lot of, we used to have a schooner, so Max had a lot of line for the old schooner. And he taught the fishermen, they dug the grave, and he taught them how to lay the ropes too.
Where was he buried? In the Captiva cemetery?
Yes, in the cemetery.
He's there today, huh?
Yes, he's there today.
Yeah.
And so he taught them how to lower a coffin. And then he went out on the beach, and Mr. Carr was just sauntering up the beach, and he says, hurry on, get this funeral. No relation of mine. He said, I'm not going to do anything. Max said, well, who's going to conduct the service? He said, well, I guess you'll have to.
Oh,
Max, he didn't know what to do.
how many people were here in the cemetery? You and Max?
No, I wasn't. I had to take care of the score.
Oh, I see.
I was home taking care of the score. There was only the fishermen, about 4 or 5 of them, Andy Rossi, and Jimmy Whiteman. He came down in white trousers and a southwester coat and a white sailor hat, you know, not a sailor, you know, one of those flat straw hats.
Yes, yes.
Pancake
A boater,
thing.
yes.
Yeah. And so Max made him sit astride the coffin to hold it in the trailer. And then the fishermen and all either shoveled or lifted the car and the trailer over these windows to get up to the cemetery.
Oh my.
It was a terrible ordeal. But they got up there all right. And Max said, here, Jimmy, you're always spouting the Bible. You conduct the service. Oh, no, he said, and he started running.
Who dug the grave?
Oh, the fishermen dug
Oh,
the grave.
they, okay.
There was Andy and Caraway and Wiley, somebody or other, and Mrs. Wiley was there. And
These were commercial fishermen?
All commercial
Yes,
fishermen.
yes.
We had quite a few on the island at that time.
Mhm.
They lived up on Palm Avenue or but in shacks or so forth.
Mhm.
And they had dug the grave. And so Max said, well, I guess I'll have to do it. He didn't even know the captain's name except Captain Smith. And all he knew about him was that he was a captain of one of Vanderbilt's racing yachts, the American Contender.
Oh?
And so he knew that, knew a little story about him. So he talked about his sailing life and what a great captain he'd been. And then he did a little prayer. He said, I wanted him to say the 23rd Psalm, but he said, I thought I'd get stuck in the middle of it. He said, you know, when you have to do something in a hurry, you can't remember everything.
Of course not.
And so he said, I just didn't dare start it. And
Maybe nobody else would have known if he bogged down. They wouldn't know.
Yeah, oh yes, Mrs. Wiley, one of the fishermen's wives, said, Mr. Hayford, if you'd only asked me, I could have said the whole thing. Nobody thought to bring a Bible or anything with them, you know.
No.
But she said, I could have said the whole thing, the Lord's Prayer, I could have helped you out. I said, why didn't you speak up?
Oh.
But anyway, he made his own prayer, and Mrs. Smith congratulated him, said that was a fine sermon, and so forth. And so Max said, well, now, somebody take her and take her home, or I'll drive her home, and you fellas lower the casket and fill the grave. So he did, and then he came home to me. And Dalton came with him because he knew I was having a bad experience. But anyway, that was the end.
You were staying home with Grandma Gore.
Oh, well, somebody had to.
Well, of course.
Heavens, you couldn't leave her for more than 10 minutes.
But now, was this storm still blowing like the dickens?
It was blowing pretty hard, yes. And that was at first about 2 o'clock it started to rain, and it hadn't rained at all. It was a completely dry hurricane, which is very unusual.
Yes.
It started to just drizzle and spit rain. Yes, it was blowing 60 miles an hour. at least.
I wondered what was the magnitude of the hurricane? I
Oh,
mean,
it
do
was
official
big.
records say what it was?
Yeah, it
at
was a
that
very
time?
bad hurricane,
It
one
was
of our worst.
Hmm.
I think the 26 storm was listed as the worst, and the 44 is next. Then we had a storm, I say in 46, and some people say 47, but I'm sure it was 46 because we were building this room at that time, and we didn't have all the windows completely, and we had to nail up boards and sheets over it, so I know. possibly
Now,
it was
in
46.
any of these hurricanes, have you ever known of these huge surges of water? This is what they tell us today we have to worry about more than wind, are flood surges. You've
We
never
had no
seen this.
flood. The water did come in before the 44 storm and 46. Since the wind was offshore here, all of the water went out of the bay. Everything was left high and dry practically. And
The
then
bay
all
was
of a sudden-
dry?
The bay was practically dry. And then all of a sudden, when the storm did hit here, the water did come in. In fact, when our boat was here and Mr. Jenkins was taking care of it, and it was up in Alan Bryan's Harbor, the 46 storm that was. And there was such high water in the bay that he couldn't even see the railings of her dock, and we had a hard time finding it, only because he could see our boat and the lines tying it to a tree or something or other.
This water came back from the Gulf and swept right over it again. Did it get into your house?
No, didn't come over the road. We've never had any water over the road.
You haven't.
No.
Now that's amazing. I guess lucky as much as anything.
Let me say this, we did have one. That was, and I don't know whether you've heard this story or not. We had a time when there evidently was an underwater eruption out in the Gulf, and we had a tremendous wave that came. And at that time, our little cabana out there was screened, and I had some redwood furniture out there and a chaise and a card table. And it was completely demolished by a cabbage log that came in and came right through the house and just completely wrecked it. Didn't wreck the uprights or anything, but wrecked the screening.
This is
and
where the
furniture.
Hoffman.
What's that?
This is where when you
No, right
go
out
right
here.
out here.
Right
You
out
gotta
here.
come back.
Right out here. And Miss Gillette, when we that morning, it was early in the morning. It was before about 7 o'clock. And Pearl, my colored, long favorite, that was with me for 30 years, was just arriving, and Johnny, her grandson, had brought her. And she said, Mrs. Hayford, there was a tremendous wave came in. And Johnny said, yes, it was a tremendous wave, and it did cross over the road, but just the crest of the wave did, not anything else. And so we got up and jumped up and went out there to look, see, and it had just demolished our furniture. But Mrs. Gillette went swimming every morning.
This is
And
Isabel Gillette.
Isabel Gillette. And
This is
they were
Betty Day's mother.
yes, and
Yes.
they were in the McMurray house.
Yes.
And she was just standing by the door, looking out at the Gulf, in her bathing suit, and was going out to go swimming. And all of a sudden she said, Ken, look here. And she said there was a tremendous wall of water that came in, and came right in, but did not quite reach the house. And the house is up close.
Yes. For heaven.
It just the edge of the wave, the last wave, came
To the
right
house.
up to the edge of the house.
And
But if
that
she'd
was,
gone
but
in,
this
it
was
was-
not a hurricane. It was just
no, it was just
a
no
wave
wind,
out of nowhere.
a wave out of no wind, no nothing with it. It was just a wave.
And that's the only one that ever came across the road.
Well, it didn't really cross the road. Just a little crest of it came across the road, and it didn't go even up to Gulf View. It was just down this way, from Twin Waters down.
Now, our house is built on no more than 3, maybe 2 cinder blocks high, and there has never been water in it. The floors are lovely, and there's never been a drop of water in that house. And this surprises me, because now when they talk about any buildings on Captiva now must be 13.5 feet high for the water. My feeling is that a 13-foot in the air house is going to be blown away 10 times oftener than it's going to be water washed away into the house.
Now, at that time, you see, Al O'Brien's dock was very low, and that's why hers was completely surrounded by. We didn't get water back here. Now, Jennings was living in his house, and there was never any water in his house, and it was like your house, just
Right on the bay.
Right on, just not more than this 2 feet above the ground.
Right. And there's never been water?
No.
No, we've never had any water.
We've had a
either.
few inches of water that came up, but not more than 2 or 3 inches that came up over the land, up about halfway to the robin's nest, but never any past that.
No. Now we have, just in my time, since 70, we have had a flood that came. It rained like the dickens one evening, and the rain water laid all up, a couple of inches on the ground, and at the same time a southeast wind blew the bay over the top, and that tide up until midnight crept right up to our, almost to our front door.
Funny story. You remember the Rennicks that built the Loomis house?
I know that name, that he was a builder, wasn't he?
He was a builder. Well, they were here. This was the 46 hurricane, I think, 47. And they were very frugal people, and she had made a pumpkin pie and an apple pie, thinking that they would be isolated in the house for a while or something or other. And then she decided, well, my gracious, we can't have all that wasted. The wind got to roaring so, and they had a lot of trees around their place, and they thought, well, they were just going to be demolished, and they were going to die. So she said, oh, and we had a bottle of medicinal whiskey. They called it medicinal whiskey. And so they started drinking that, and they ate every bit of food in the house. There wasn't one midget left. And the next morning, Andy Rossi came wading in, and they did have about a foot of water around their place. And he came wading in, and he said, how are you? Well, she said, we're alive. And he said, well, yes. She said, we haven't a thing to eat in the house. We ate it all up last night thinking we were going to die.
Oh. They ate all the food and drank all the medicinal whiskey.
Drank all the medicinal whiskey and ate the 2 pies and all the bread and all the cheese and all the food that they had. The chicken, they had a fried chicken. They ate everything they had in the house.
Yes, they oh.
They were perfectly all right.
Oh. Now, where did these Rennicks live? Was that?
Rennicks, they were in, the house, which was Dr. Howe's house, remember? And then Paul Everett owned it and lived in it
yes.
for a time. Well, that's the house.
That's the house.
That's the house.
Yes. Not the one right next door to us.
No.
The house next door to us was Judge Williams.
Yes, Judge Williams, and I knew Judge Williams.
Yes.
He was a fine old
And that's the one that Jack Sparks now
yes,
lives in.
that's right.
Yes.
No, it's the house back on the from the bay.
Where Bob Sabatino lives.
Yes, that's it. That's
Yes.
Sabatino house. That's right.
That's the
It's
one.
The Sabatino house. The
Yes.
Queen's house.
Yes. Well, at the time my folks bought the house they're in, that house was also for sale, and they had a choice of that one or the one they bought.
They were much better.
Well, I thought so too when I saw the 2 of them. The only thing, I think the other had more property, and Mother said at the time it had lovely landscaping and lawns and gardens. And I think it went clear back to
That's right.
Munson Street.
That's
and
right.
she said it was a big piece of property with lovely lawns and gardens.
And beautiful flowers and beautiful gardens. They had just all kinds of flowers when Dr. Howe had it.
Yes. But then I've often thought, now when I look at it, how wisely they chose. I'm so glad that they're on the bay rather than that one.
That's another funny story. Did you ever hear the story about how Dr. Howe caught his first tarpon?
No.
Well, that's another very funny story.
So
He
tell
had fished and fished and fished for years. And finally he said, well, I'm going to make I'm going to leave the island, I'm going to make one last try for a tarpon. So he went up to Redfish Pass, and he fished, but he didn't land any tarpon until just as he was going home, he had a strike, and the tarpon came around and jumped in the boat. And he had to jump out of it.
Oh, no.
Well, a tarpon thrashing around can be very dangerous.
Imagine
But it flopped out, and then so he didn't get his tarpon.
And this was Dr. Howe.
This was Dr. Howe.
Oh. Now, when did Redfish pass?
That was 26.
That was the hurricane of 26. Because some people have said it was much later than that, and 26 it was cut through. Well, I know when we came in 48, it was pretty wide.
Yeah.
But still,
It
when
was
we
not.
went through it in a boat.
It was very shallow.
Yes, because our children said, well, that wouldn't be bad to swim across. And my dad says, well, don't ever try it.
Don't ever try it.
Somebody was drowned doing it.
Mm.
Now, Betsy Steyert says that during the war, when she and her children stayed down here with her mother,
Yeah.
she and Jean Loomis used to take the children to South Seas and with a picnic at low tide wade across to Upper Captiva. And it was still, now this was 41, 42, whenever
Yeah.
the war was, it was still shallow enough that they could wade across.
It was very shallow. You see, it had always been just a sand spit, actually. And Olive Bryan, with her first boat, couldn't get through that. She had to come through Captiva Pass. She could never get through Redfish Pass.
I see.
But then it started washing away, and with the 44 storm and the 46 storm, it got deeper and deeper and deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's a very deep pass.
Oh, it's our tap, whatever it is, depth finder shows 40 and 50 feet in some places through there. And I guess it's scouring it out deeper and deeper, and
Yeah.
this is why we've lost all of our sand. The erosion has really
That's
been
right.
caused by that
You know,
riptide.
the old Dutchman that was here said that the only way to stop the erosion here is to fill in Redfish Pass. Well, you can't do it now.
No, but if they had maybe done it then. But you
Yeah.
know, the fishermen thought that was such a boon for getting through, and it brought so many good fish through.
I know.
In fact,
They were dead against it.
I have heard it accused that the people who manage South Seas dug that out at night to make that better fishing and to bring their boats in.
I haven't heard that story.
I have heard that when they were building their marina there, that was, you know, they were
I
not
don't-
averse to opening the channel a little bit wider.
I don't doubt it. I'm probably very sure of it. And you know who did it.
Yes, of course. But this all made it a much more attractive resort
Oh, my,
to
yes.
have that.
Yes.
And it was done very quietly. Very, you know, one day it was wadeable to get across, and all of a sudden you could get quite good-sized boats through. And strangely enough, just about that time they built a marina at South Seas, and so it was very handy for the boats coming and going.
That's right.
So it could have been. Could have been.
Very interesting.
Yeah, if true.
Well, I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it at all.
Yeah.
I don't doubt it at all. Well, let's see if I can think of anything more stories.
How about Donna? Were you here during Hurricane
Oh, my,
Donna?
yes. And I had 26 people. Oh, that was a terrible night. You know, the sheriff came through about 3 o'clock in the morning, yelling, "Everybody has to get off the island. Everybody has to get off the island." Well, Dodie Booth was here, and the Ballingers were here, and the McCalls were here, and Mrs. Strand, and Dr. Miss, no, not Dr. Miss Hyman weren't here that time, but a man from down around the corner, I can't think of what his name is, down where Susan Carr lives, down in there, was here. Well, we had about 26 or 7 or 28 people here.
All in your house during
All
the
here.
hurricane? They
All
all
here.
chose not to go to the mainland.
No, I wouldn't go to the mainland. Couldn't get me to go at any time. I'm right here. I've already had people say, "We're coming to stay with you."
Oh,
Dodie Booth came, and when that sheriff came through, at that time I was sleeping up at the Pink House, and everybody was in here, but I was up there by myself. But I came dashing down in front of her, and I said, "Well, I hope you aren't going." They were going to take him by helicopter. Well, it was blowing 60 to 80 miles an hour then.
you couldn't have gotten it off the ground.
Well, they did, but it was a very terrible trip. Dodie went, and Mary Ballinger, and you know Mary.
Oh, they went in the helicopter.
They went in the helicopter. They had a terrible experience. You know, Mary had a colostomy operation.
Yes, yes.
So it was very bad for her. And they took him to a school, and all the windows blew out of the school, and all they had were dried up ham sandwiches. and they had to move in the middle of the night from that school to another school. They had a perfectly terrible experience. Well, Beulah Wiles was here, and T.M. and Judy Wiles, and we had a great time. Everybody brought a lot of food. Beulah bought a great big kettle of homemade vegetable soup, and I had a couple of chickens and a roast, And then somebody else, oh, Mary Bounger brought lots of sweet rolls and donuts. And we had all the coffee we needed. And at the time, I had a gas icebox and I had a gas stove.
Mm-hmm.
So that we had all the ice we wanted, and we had all the nice stove to hold everything, even if when the electricity went off, it didn't bother us at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, this was still, this room wasn't built at that time. This was the end of the living room. This was open windows here.
Mm-hmm.
But I had I had 2 mattresses, I had a couple of mattresses in the dining room, and then I had 3 in the front bedroom, and I had 3 in my bedroom here. But I was sleeping up at the Pink House.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran down, and then I said, "Don't go." Dodie got very hysterical. She just got wild. She just, she gets up and moves all to pieces. She said, I'm going, I'm scared to death, I can't stay. Well, Ray said, I'm staying. And Dale said, well, I'm staying. Well, Mary said, well, I better go with Dodie. So those 2 went, that's all that went.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of us stayed here, and we had a wonderful time. We stood out on my bathroom porch and took bets on when the next pine tree, there were 48 pine trees went down next to us over there, and we take bets on how long, which one was going to go next. And there was one left standing, and we took bets on whether that was going to stand or not. And I said, well, that'll stand because this house breaks the wind for it. Mm-hmm. So it stood. It's the only one left there, the old pines. All these others that knew that they planted since, and they're all crazy. I don't know why.
I wouldn't plant one of those pine trees for anything.
Well, they planted the other kind that root themselves by, propagating roots. Mm-hmm. And Denny spent all of Saturday morning chopping down the roots that were growing up to our driveway, and he had a whole wheelbarrow load of pine rootlets coming up there. And those pines are so tall now that if they blow over, they're going to take our electric lines down and everything else.
Hmm. Now, how long did, say, Donna last? How long was it actually going on that you were?
It was going out during the daytime. It struck here in the middle of the day, in the morning, early morning, and lasted all day. Because the wind came from this direction first, and then it comes around, and then it came from this direction. Mm-hmm. And so it was until the middle of the afternoon before it was over.
Was it raining all badly all this time?
Oh, pouring, yes.
Yeah.
Pouring.
Yeah. But no water surges again. Never had that.
They said that Donna, they said there was an 8-foot wave at Everglades City, and there was there.
Yes.
But you see, then it cut inland, and then it came across from Fort Myers across here.
Fort Myers Beach got it badly,
Oh,
too.
badly.
They had
so
a terrible
did Fort Myers. So did Fort Myers.
Oh, way up into the city?
Oh, it came from the city across.
I see.
It came up from Everglades, up the trail, and then across from Fort Myers across. Fort Myers was, they said, was wiped off the map. It wasn't, but it had a terrible, houses, roofs off the houses, and it got a terrible, and pine trees down everywhere. And Fort Myers got it bad, Beach got it bad, but they got it worse during the 44 hurricane because that practically everything on the beach was just wiped off. Mm-hmm. There were ice boxes and toilets all over the beach road and everything after the 44 storm.
Oh my.
It was just a wreck. We had a professor from Northwestern that had a home down there, and we went out to see what, and it was just a wreck.
Well, I bet you feel you're still glad you're on the ground in a concrete block house rather than up on pilings.
You know, when we were in Al O'Brien's house, her shingles just was like a great giant typewriter. It clattered, 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 clattered. You couldn't hear yourself talk in the house there. You just felt every movement of the house.
And yet now in none of these hurricanes did the eye go right through here, did they?
No.
These were always the outskirts.
Yeah, it was the first two, 44 and 46, were offshore, about 5 miles offshore. And we did have a long eye, but it wasn't, and we had terrible winds. We had quite an eye with the Donna storm, too.
Yes,
It came across here and then up the Gulf.
Yes.
It blew right across the island, out into the Gulf, and then it went up the Gulf, came into Pensacola, I think, or someplace up in there. But I don't mind a hurricane.
And you'd stay through another one?
Oh, I certainly would. I wouldn't leave down.
Wouldn't
You
think
couldn't get me to leave down.
You couldn't.
Mm-mm.
Well, if we're here, this is where we'll come.
Well, Ray Booth already told me. Jody won't leave down, and she's coming right down to Eugene. Well, we had another storm that was reputed to be coming our way. It didn't. It never got up past Everglades City. It went over to Miami. But Jody was here. Oh, Maybelle was here during the
Maybelle Stanford?
Here.
Yes.
But and she didn't go in town. But Maybelle was up with us, and at that time everybody stayed with me up in the Pink House, although some of them were down here. But we weren't sure that it was going to be a hurricane, and they played the poker all night long.
Oh.
Dr. Hyman was there, and Mrs. Hyman, and they went to bed out in the back bedroom. So we never heard from them at all. But all the rest of them were very gay, and they played in that open porch. There wasn't open at that time. I closed it in, but that was a big room, and they sat down on the floor and had just a wonderful time.
Well, I wouldn't be afraid of the wind, but I just get a little worried about these
I'm 14
water
feet above
sturges.
sea level.
How many feet?
14 feet.
Oh, you are?
And look how far back I am.
That's amazing.
And you see, as I say, I had two beachheads in front of me, and if the water came across, it would disperse sideways, and so the force of the water would not be so bad.
Your house would be apt to stay, and
Oh,
because your husband built it, it was built to last.
It's built to last.
Yes. Yeah. I bet there aren't as many as well built as
When I was
this.
doing this remodeling here, they had a terrible time knocking this wall out. They said, "My gosh, this concrete is hard." I said, "Well, that's believed in strong concrete. When I want to drive a nail in to hang a picture or something, I have a terrible time. I just can't do it. It just can't."
Jean, I think you've been talking long enough. I don't want you to overdo now. Thank you very, very much, and I think even posterity is going to enjoy reading it.
Listen, it's fine. How about having a drink with me?
Well, thanks, but my husband will be waiting to have one with me.